back in 2010, it used to cost you about $6,500 to move a container here.
Right.
And today you can do it $3,600. It's about a 45% decline in the cost. For Rwanda, that's what it means. For the region, transport costs have fallen on average by about 40%. And the collective impact of the trademark program, it's a hard thing because you're looking at the effects of hardware and software aspects, infrastructure and the use of infrastructure, the way that trade operates.
All right.
Broadly, the benefit streams were valued at about $14 billion over a 10-year period, okay, by the UK government. And essentially, that's been delivered. So for about the total program that we ran in the first phase, or strategy one, was about $500 million. So broadly, you know, you're talking about a $28 return per dollar invested.
Right.
So that internal rate of return is very high.
Right.
And some of the things that contributed to that, 50% decline in the time it takes to move goods through the ports.
Right.
The ports were the biggest bottleneck. The borders, 70% on average decline through the borders. And I think you talked about that with my colleagues.
Right.
So that's been a very credible result. But I think the other thing that really has been important is the automation. And some of that has had really strong effects. So here in Rwanda, we're here in Rwanda, so let's talk about Rwanda a bit. The single window that we developed here has reduced the time to clear goods from about 11 days now to just over 1 day.
Right.
Those are really big savings. And those sort of savings pay back very quickly.
Trade platforms across the region are finding it hard to map out the trade initiatives or interventions within huge chunks of time, but you're doing it within in 6 years, is it? 5 years? Just speak to us about handling some of these interventions efficiently within that time. That's
an interesting question because at the peak in our first phase, we ran a portfolio of about 250 projects, varying from $100 million port investment to, you know, I don't know, $500,000
right.
with advocacy groups. So we actually have a couple of principles that really help us. Portfolio effects. When you invest money, as I used to be a fund manager before I got into development, you know, you have to have high risk as well as low risk stocks that you put your money in
right.
to maximize your portfolio return. And that's kind of the way that we've tried to look at the portfolio. We have some high risk projects, but very high return. And then we also have projects that return results quicker, like the automation
right.
we just talked about. That's a very different payback period than a port where you're building, say, access roads that can take you 3 or 4 years, or a border post.
Right.
So what we try to do is manage the portfolio so that the benefit stream, basically that we have benefits coming through every year. So it's a mixture between long and short-term investments.
Right.
And then also we've got quite a good MIS platform that we're actually now just upgrading that looks at how projects are doing. The other key thing we learned is kill your failures quickly. Okay,
Right,
if projects are not working out, close them down quick. And I think finally, commitment. You know, a lot of the things that we do are not that difficult in themselves. You could do a lot of them, I'm sure, but the political commitment is key.
Right.
And what we found is that if some partners are not willing to move at a given pace, we kill it.
Right.
Because, you know, if their buy-in isn't strong, we shouldn't be doing the project in the first place.
Right.
You know, and we worked with a whole variety of different players, be they Chinese, European, American, US, you know, from all over the globe. And for example, in Mombasa Port, we have the EIB, European Investment Bank, and the Agence Française
right.
de Développement from the government of France, investing about $500 million in some of the port projects that we prepared. Now, what we've also tried to do then is to get companies to invest, and I think that's a different level of investment. And you know, one of the things we're exploring is how can we help our region to industrialize quicker? Right. And we're going to need to see strong levels of investment. And to me, that'll come from Europe and the US, but also from China. So we've been stepping it up, and we are very keen to work with Chinese investors, right. where particularly they can create jobs, but most importantly, where there's potential for backward and forward linkage development.
In your second phase, you've committed to work to support construction of harbour facilities in Rwanda, in Rubavu and Rusizi ports in Lake Kivu. But we're concerned about the extent of implementation or the extent of financing that you'll be getting into.
Well, you can always have more finance. And I think one of the things that we're hoping to do is develop a number of those projects with private sector capital.
Right.
So we're not just thinking about them being a pure grant or government project, we're thinking about them being PPPs.
Right.
And there, you prepare the project and the private sector invests in the project and then obviously leverages a lot or catalyzes a lot more investment than you can do.
Right.
So oftentimes, I mean, the Kigali logistics platform, I think
Right.
here in Kigali, that's a project that we took from concept all the way through to closure. And it's now being put together and invested in by a private sector operator. So the amount of money that we put in compared to the end value of the project, of course, is many times less. So we try to think very hard about how we can use our capital to the best effect.
Right.
And then the second thing we're thinking about as we put projects into effect is, as we're thinking we might revolve our capital, then obviously we can syndicate finance around us.
We'll get a case of Tanzania. VAT removal has pushed transit cargo 35% up. We saw that conversation just happened recently. The government budget scrapped off VAT on transit goods. How replicable is this conversation?
I think it's quite important not to tax it because, what is transit trade? Transit trade in the end, of course, is either for manufacturing or for consumption purposes, right? So if you're importing inputs into Rwanda, say we're importing cloth to turn into shirts that then are exported, that would be like a tax on those imports, which one has to be careful of.
Right.
So I think the removal of those transit taxes is really rather important. I'm not aware that that's such a big issue in other parts of the community, if I'm honest. I think it's mainly been an issue really with Tanzania, and I'm very glad that that's been resolved. And certainly the government, I know, have asked our advice on that.
All right. You mentioned on social media that there was a next generation trade facilitation reforms conversation and industrial cluster development with the TME team and RDB.
Yep.
Please break that down.
Yeah, no, well, I think we've had a lot of success with some of the stuff we've talked about.
Right.
The single window, the automation of trade processes. And I think taking those now to the next level where you bring national systems together and you create seamless corridors, electronic corridors for trade, would be the next step that we want to take.
Right.
So the cargo tracking system that we've invested in here, that's brought down the time it takes to move trucks, it's increased government revenues. Having that regionally, and that would include Tanzania, I think would be the next step. So to make that completely across the whole region, not just the Northern Corridor countries.
Right.
So I think that there's a next generation of trade facilitation reforms in that respect. And then when we think about the industrial cluster development that I was talking about, really in developing industrial zones and bringing investment and expertise into them, we should start to think clearly about export channels, very clear export corridors that could be expedited to help our competitiveness. So those are the kind of things that we were discussing with the government here, which are quite exciting. And I've always found the government in Rwanda very progressive, very progressive, and it delivers what it promises, which is critical. So I think we're quite interested to unlock that next generation of reforms, to think about industrial land development and crowding in investment, and then obviously thinking hard about the backward and forward linkages. And finally, the other thing we've discussed is the biggest export market for Rwanda is DRC. So how do we unlock the potential of that trade? Now, I mean, you mentioned yourself, the Rubavu cross-border market is one way to do that. Developing the border at Usisi is another one. There are other things that we can do to try to help trade be more seamless. So those are the kind of issues that we're discussing, and how we then use the 45 million initial capital we have to maximize the benefit streams. So, that's always a very exciting agenda.
All right. My final point has to do with what's happening end of this month. We have the African Trade Development Forum. So I'll ask it in a two-part question. What do we expect you to bring to the table during that forum? And during the 2010-2017, we saw automation processes taking a center stage of conversations. What are you prioritizing in your second phase?
Okay. Well, the Trade Development Forum that's happening in Kampala is going to bring together all of our different partners around the region and, first of all, look at the results we achieved. What have we learned from them? How can we do better? The second question will be, are the ideas that we have for our second phase the best ones? Are we going to be able to have the best impact? So that's the idea. We've got some great speakers coming along, Mukisa Ketui from UNCTAD and Pascal Lamy, ex-DG at WTO. Right. So that'll be great, and I think we've got the Vice President from Uganda, so that'll be a good one, and we hope to have you there. Right. So what are the key things that we're trying in the next phase? I think the key thing is to think about unlocking trade with East Africa's neighbors, okay? And I mean, one neighbor is Congo, DRC, right. Another one would be Ethiopia to the north that we talked about. Right. To the south, Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique. Right. So how can we get cross-border trade by happening by focusing on the external borders? Right. The second big area for us is going to be this industrial development. And what we're hoping to do here, we're going to do in every country. Right. So we're going to be piloting a zone approach, one in each country. And then if that works, we'd like to scale it. Right. Because, in the end, my belief is that there are a lot of jobs that are going to be offshored out of China. Mm-hmm. We need to capture them here in right. East Africa. A lot of these single windows in each country aren't fully populated. Right. So it means all the different trade processes that are required to move goods across borders, basically we've automated probably around 70%. Right. There's still 30% to go. So they have to be finished. Then the other aspect of automation will be to link the national single windows together regionally. Right. So you create, as I was trying to explain, that electronic corridor. And finally, you need to think about how then you can link that up globally. So we're doing a pilot with some commercial companies, for example, Maersk, right. Thinking about how for key exports that we get from East Africa, horticultural, coffee, tea, how can we create a seamless pipe for that trade right. From basically the field all the way through to the consumer? So that would mean that our goods can be more competitive in the marketplace. For example, our coffee is stopped at borders and searched because people aren't sure what's inside. They don't have the evidence that it's coffee, it's not something else. Right. So that means our coffee takes longer to clear, is more expensive, say for example, than South American coffee. Right. So we would want to speed that up through these electronic corridors, okay? So that all the documentation, all the way from the farmer level to the final end user, is available online, right. And that basically the goods can move quicker and more effectively.